Of the forum, I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this evening. I'm Mark Lindenberg, a lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government, and I will be the coordinator of the panel this evening. Our topic this evening is Central America Future Challenges, and it's interesting to begin thinking about America's perception, the United States' perception of Central America, by looking at the most recent American Opinion Survey of U.S. foreign policy, the 1991 Opinion Survey. And in contrast to previous years, where Central America in the 1980s was at the top of United States perceptions of important U.S. foreign policy issues, it doesn't appear at all in the 1991 survey. To a certain extent, El Salvador is there, but Central America does not appear. It is not a prominent or salient issue in the way that it was in the 1980s. And this, in essence, reflects a U.S. schizophrenia in its relationship to Central America and Latin America. We have periods of intense attention and sometimes over-attention to that part of the world, followed by periods of complete ignoring of the region and its problems, its concerns. It's interesting to relate these cycles to cycles of economic growth, economic collapse, and violence in Central America. And one can stretch them out. Most of us have lived through the cycle that began in 1978 through about 1986. But if you go back to the early 1800s, you'll find almost 7 cyclic changes in Central American growth and economic performance cycles of violence and transition that coincide with cycles of intense outside attention in the region. What coincides with the Central American growth periods? Usually, the world economy is growing. Central America, with its traditional export products, seems to do well in those periods, and you get long cycles of growth with differences in the way that growth is used in income distribution terms. Some countries like Costa Rica relate that to investments in education and health. Other countries do not. We have cycles at the same time of economic collapse, which often coincide with periods of world economic collapse at the same time. And normally, when you look at the cycles, there may be 5 features of them. The first is that they're accompanied usually with high levels of political instability and tremendous discontent on the part of the region's population, usually correlated with higher and higher levels of violence, usually correlated as well with levels of repression in most of the countries in the region. And up until this point, they have correlated with the transfer of power from one military leader to another. It's usually served to permit the transfer, a transition through military coup from one military leader to another. The final feature of these 5 factors would be a consolidation period with a new economic strategy, new civil-military relationships, and then often Central America then piggybacks on the growth of the region or the growth of the world economy, and you see things go. Most of us are familiar with the last cycle, which began in 1978 after the second oil shock and has gone into the 1990s. And there are 2 points of view about where we are in 1990 at this point. Optimists think that Central American economies have been highly diversified during the 1980s, that there's potential really for future growth. And optimists as well, both scholars and Central Americans from the region who are practitioners, citizens, also point to the fact that this is virtually the only time that all 5 countries have democratically elected Central American presidents, and some add without at least major accusations of fraud in the electoral process. Optimists also point out that this is the first time that 4 of the 5 countries have transferred power from one democratically elected president to another, so that it's an unusual period in the region for the optimists. The pessimists see this as a period of weak economic transition which cannot be consolidated, and as the evidence of weak democratic forms rather than substance in the 1990s, and hope that there will be a democratic consolidation, but they're pessimistic. Our 3 panelists this evening are uniquely qualified to comment on the past and future of the region, the last 10 years as well as the next 10. Each has played an important leadership role in their country. Each has had to live with very, very difficult problems and painful and difficult searches for solutions to which many of the countries have not faced exactly these problems before. Each is here to reflect on their experiences, and each may play some role in the future in their own country's future development. Let me introduce each of our panelists to you, and I'll introduce them starting at the far end of the table, and then we'll begin and ask for their impressions of the past and future of the region. Beginning with one of our colleagues, Jose Maria Figueres. Jose Maria played important roles in Costa Rica during the economic and political transitions in that country. He served as Minister of Exports for Costa Rica in recent years during the difficult period when Costa Rica had to think through how to diversify into non-traditional exports, how to expand basically its export base and try to provide Costa Rica with a stable and productive economic future. He also served as Minister of Agriculture in that country recently during a difficult period of transition with removal of subsidies for various agricultural products, rice and others to name some, and had to suffer the difficulties of negotiating under very tough circumstances with groups that may not have been particularly happy about a tough transition process. Salvador Mayorga Sacasa, sitting in the center, is from Nicaragua and served in difficult times as the Vice Minister of Agriculture and earlier as Director of the General Director of the Institute of Land Reform. He was within the Sandinista government and administration and obviously served during a difficult and unique period of land reform in Nicaragua, not unconflictive, to say the least. And within the agricultural sector, as Vice Minister of Agriculture, presided over and worked hard to begin to build a mixed economy in agriculture with state enterprises on the one hand, a cooperative sector, and a private sector. Not a very easy task either, and full of conflict. Our final panelist, Hector Gramacho, who's sitting directly next to me, was the Minister of Defense of his country, Guatemala, during the administration of Vinicio Cerezo, the first democratically elected president in that country for some time. It's difficult to talk about reasonably transitions from military rule unless one is willing to talk with people who are military people. And Hector Gramacho has a unique perspective on those transitions and in some ways move the process along in another highly conflictive situation. So that each of our panelists this evening have played unique roles. Each have had to search for solutions where it wasn't clear that there were any. Each have had to manage intense conflict. Each have been criticized in their countries, and each have been praised in their countries. Having said that, I think it's best to let Central Americans tell their story about the region and its past and future, and perhaps after that we can ask them questions. We'll begin with Hector Gramacho, who will speak a bit about the past and future of the region.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening. I want to address the problems and challenges of Guatemala, but I was asked for my colleagues to set the foundation, the historical foundation for the region. So you all have the perspective of what we are referring to. Central America, I guess we might say that there are three Central Americans. The geographic Central America extends from Guatemala and Belize to Panama. The sociological Central, or the historical Central America, is from Guatemala to Costa Rica, derives from the Spaniards. And the sociological Central America, it means the addition or the factor of the different ethnic groups in the countries from Guatemala to Nicaragua. So these are three different Central Americas. And the legacy of the Spaniards is a major component on the outcomes in the modern history of Central America. Needless to say, the Spaniards, during the colonial days, they set a social and economic order on the new lands, the new acquired or the conquered lands. So this is one of the main factors, the social economic structure left by the Spaniards. So much to say in general for Central America. Now in reference to Guatemala, in a very short 10 minutes, I'll try to make reference to transitions, economic and political transitions in the 80s, as I was asked by Mark. But in this case, I will spend some 5 minutes trying to explain why we need or why we had a transition in the 80s. So, beginning from the social and economic structure left by the Spaniards during the colonial days, in 1871, a reform movement took away lands from the Roman Catholic Church and redistributed the land over the peasants. And so we have a growing middle class, very small, but the first signs of a middle class in Guatemala, 1871. In 1944, we had our revolution. And this, in 1944 revolution, social, political, and economic changes occur in Guatemala. These economic, social, and political changes really expanded the middle class in Guatemala. I have to sound now a little bit of a cliche, but unfortunately I have to do that. The why of the many of the latest problems of Guatemala are based in the ideological and economic alliances that were made after the World War II, especially in Western Europe. United States formed economic and political alliances to confront communism, to confront Marxist-Leninism, and based on the doctrine of national security. The doctrine of national security states that the state, the government, is responsible to protect the achievements of the society. The state has to provide a secure environment, both physical and psychological. The obligation of the people in this type of state is only to work for their own welfare, according with the established economic and social order. So this is the doctrine of national security, and this is fine, outstanding. This is very good for a developed country. But in 1947, certainly the economic order and the social order for Guatemalans did not please the majority of Guatemalans. And I doubt that by the 1950s, many Latin American countries had their own defense doctrine. I doubt that nowadays many Latin American countries have their own defense doctrine. So within these frames of the Cold War in 1947, early 50s, Guatemala, expanding on the gains of the revolution of 1944, was implementing an agrarian reform. And here we suffer three unfortunate coincidences for Guatemala. The first unfortunate coincidence for Guatemala is the largest extension of land were property of the United Fruit Company, a U.S. firm. The second unfortunate coincidence was that Mr. John Foster Dulles, an attorney at law, worked previously for the company, United Fruit Company, was the Secretary of State of the United States. And the second unfortunate coincidence for Guatemala is that his brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So this is a tremendous impact for us, the Guatemalans. Within the frames of the Cold War, to defend the war from communism, Guatemalan president was ousted. Actually, Guatemala is a case study for counter-agrarian reform instead of a case study for agrarian reform. And to protect the achievements of the Guatemalan society, or in other words, to protect the status quo, the national security doctrine was the base for the new constitution in 1956. The new constitution in 1956 provided for the exclusion of certain political groups and special privileges for another political groups, limiting the development of political and the civil society. Then it was all within the frames of the Cold War. And in January, in the conference of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, they said that they were going to avoid nuclear war with the states, but they were going to support wars of national liberation, and they were going to support popular uprisings. And then we have in 1961, in April, the failure, always within the frames of the Cold War, the failure of the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. Cubans from Guatemala and from Nicaragua landed and failing an invasion to oust Castro. So under the East and West Cold War, in the name of national security, political incompetence, inequalities, crimes, rigid elections, and armed confrontation were the characteristics of Guatemala until 1982. So then we have a transition. A political transition began in 1982 with a coup d'etat. Since 1982, we Guatemalans, especially the military, we dropped, we forgot, we did away, we renounced the doctrine of national security. And we now are within the very national, very sui generis strategy, the national stability, that the key word in national stability doctrine or thesis is that participation. Participation is the key word. Participation of the population, participation of everybody. And the strategy is very simple, very, very simple. First, political participation. Then, with political legitimacy, economic changes. Then, with economic changes, social justice. So it's we being, I have here a laundry list of many things within these frames, but I will skip it just to move forward to the challenges. I won't say very much about the economic transitions, but we really did not have economic transition in Guatemala, just political transition. So economic transition, it was a very mild, very basic stabilization program that tried to implement in 1987. But this was the problem that the former government had to confront the rest of its government. So we did not move forward very much in economic transitions. But we have a political transition. I will say that the changes, the challenges for Guatemala in the next 10 years will be, the main, of course, will be to address the chronic social problems, poverty or abandonment, but with an economic transition, of course, inside the country. Outside the country, I want there to address challenges for the region, but just for Guatemala. Outside the countries, I guess Guatemala challenge is to live or try to work closer with Mexico and Venezuela, the most inflation countries in Guatemala because of the oil. And Mexico, of course, we have a boundary. And of course, we have a dominant force in Guatemala. We have a very active foreign pressure in Guatemala, United States. So to have a pragmatic approach to the foreign policy of the United States is another challenge for Guatemala. Thank you very much.
We'll continue with Salvador Mayorga.
Well, I have to say to begin with that I agree with one that I think was the basic idea behind of Hector's opening statement, and is that the problems in Central America have been very badly misunderstood by the actors in the region, by the different actors that have been in the region, and in fact that the problems of a region have been deeply rooted in the economic and social structures that we inherited from the colony, and that have, of course, have been maintained since without very many changes. These economic and social structures have not led to development, have not led to equality, but they have rather led to very deep inequalities in the different countries of Central America. And they have not been able to lead to a sustained growth either. As Mark mentioned, I think that the history of Central American development has been a history of different crises. And the fact that these social and economic structure, and I would say rather the economic structure, was able to provide some development after the Second World War. It did provide some development, but it was a certain type of development and just for a certain period of time. But it did not provide, I mean, even this period of development did not provide for more equality or less inequality in the region. And I would even have to say that it deepened inequalities in Central America. In the last 10 years, exports fell from 4,600 million to 3,800 million. The debt service of Central American countries together went up from 12% of our exports to 40% of our exports in the period from 1979 to 1989 or 1988, and inequalities deepened during this period. If we're going to say it in terms of income, we would have to say that the top 20% of Central American population was able to get an income of about $1,700 a year in 1979, and the rest, 80%, the remaining 80% of the population was able to get only $250 per capita. Almost 10 years afterwards, the gap between the top 20% and the remaining of the population has even increased, going from, in the top 20%, 20% going from 1,300 to 1,700, and the remaining 80% stayed almost the same. I would mention also as a symptom of very high inequalities in our countries the fact that land tenure is highly concentrated in the hands of very, very few people. And in the case of my country, Nicaragua, in 1979, about 2% of the population had almost 50% of the total arable land in the country. And these deep inequalities have not, main actors in the region have not understood that these very deep inequalities are in the very roots of the conflict in Central America. And this would not be a big problem if it was just an academic issue, but the fact that the main actors in the regions have behaved within the frameworks of this misunderstanding has not helped, has not contributed at all to solve the problems of the region, but rather has made these problems even worse. And I would say that especially for the main actor the main external actor in the region, namely the United States. The fact that the United States decided a few years ago to stop Soviet expansionism in Central America may sound like a joke at this point in light of recent events in the world, but that fact had terrible consequences for Central America as a whole, and in particular for Nicaragua. In fact, we were left with 50,000 deaths just in Nicaragua. I don't know the figures about other countries of Central America. There's a claim that was supported by La Hague Tribunal of 17 billion in destruction of Nicaraguan infrastructure, and not to mention the consequences of the embargo, of a 6 or 7 years embargo over our economy, which I think are irreversible effects that, would not be reversed in 10, 20, or even 30 years. These misunderstandings about the roots of a problem in Central America made that any claim of social justice, of independence, was blamed to communism or Soviet expansionism, as I mentioned before. And well, in the history of Nicaragua, this was a recurring thing, and this deep misunderstanding of the roots of a problem in the region, I think, led the United States as a main actor in the region to this behavior, which did not help a lot at all to solve the problems in the regions. Or we wouldn't have to mention how the United States has handled the Panama Canal issue, or, well, I even think that a good example of that is what's happening in Nicaragua at this time. Of this troubleshooting behavior or fireman behavior of external actors in the region. I think a perfect example of it is what's happened with the present Nicaraguan government, and the fact that the United States did everything that was on its hand to bring this government into power, and then after it gets to power, just leave the government alone, and does not goes by word of supporting the government, even in just, even in economics terms. No substantial aid has been provided for this government at this point. So again, the United States is behaving in this case as a troubleshooter. It shooted what it thought that the problem was, and then just ran away and did not address it in a sustained fashion. So I would like to say again that the basic, the roots of a problem have been misunderstood, very deeply misunderstood. That has led to a behavior that, instead of helping to solve the problems, have made the problems even deeper, have worsened the problems, and that we have in front of us a great opportunity to behave differently at this point. And it comes from the fact, I think, that we should take advantage of the fact that this ghost of Soviet expansionism in the Central American region does not anymore exist, and I hope that no other enemy would be invented or found. And taking advantage of this fact, I think we should, as main challenges, I would just mention two things that I think that are very basic, very important. The first one is I think we should aim at some type of economic structure that enables Central American countries to sustain growth and not this cyclical behavior. I mean, no country can get away and run away from some type of cyclical behavior, but not the very deep cyclical behavior that our economies have suffered from on drawbacks. And also, I would mention as a second challenge, this growth has to be a growth with equality if it's going to lead to if it's going to lead us to get out of this vicious cycle of poverty and violence and more poverty and more violence. I think that's on the basis of our efforts to bring peace, stability, and democracy to the regions. First, growth and equality, and that'll be the basis for peace, democracy, and stability, I think. And I think that the United States has a great opportunity to show in Central America his commitment to a new world order, as it has been called. And I think that Central Americans also have, we have a great opportunity in terms of giving our contribution to this so-called new economic order, if it's really going to be a new economic order and not just re-editing the old order with a new face.
Jose Maria Figueres from Costa Rica.
Thank you, Mark. A couple of evenings ago, a good friend and classmate walked up to me when word was getting out about this event and asked me if we were organizing this as a political fundraising event. And when I said we weren't, he said, good, because the less you talk, the more we would give. So even if it is at the risk of jeopardizing any future fundraising events, I would like to compliment what the other two panelists have said. I will first talk about Costa Rica and then about Central America. Costa Rica has chosen a different path in Central America. Like Guatemala and Nicaragua, this path can also be traced to our colonial period. Spanish settlers found in Costa Rica a very small Indian population, and this led our country to be colonized instead of conquered. Spanish settlers wishing to remain in Costa Rica had to forget their dreams of large haciendas with Indian workforce. They had to do their own work, plow their own land. And this instilled in our country the roots for a nation of many small landowners. They were also very independent in their thinking. Settlers in Costa Rica chose that province because it was the farthest away from the captaincy in Guatemala. In contrast with Central America, the Catholic Church in Costa Rica, since the beginning, chose to take sides with the less fortunate, and since the beginnings of the last century, pronounced itself vigorously on issues such as minimum wages, working conditions, and social benefits. Our revolution of 1948 benefited from this rich heritage of social concern, elevated these concerns to constitutional rank, but also took advantage to set other drastic reforms that would help establish the Costa Rica we know today. It abolished the army, institutionalized free elections, and created an independent judicial system. Between 1948 and 1978, the country progressed along the lines of a welfare state. During this period, it achieved health standards equal to any developed nation, a 93% literacy rate, and a per capita income of $1,900, which, although modest, is the highest in Central America and amongst the 5 highest in all of Latin America. All of this growth was interrupted at the end of the 70s because of 2 events: the regional political and economic conflicts, which disrupted Costa Rican trade to the region and hence cut a source of foreign reserves, and our inability to continue borrowing in the international financial markets. This cutting of 2 sources of fundings led us to adopt structural economic reform programs, which were formally instituted as of 1982 in close coordination with the World Bank, the IDB, and the International Monetary Fund. Today we can say that Costa Rica is a developed nation in education, in health, in communications, and almost developed in infrastructure. Our challenge is economic development. We have to carve out our own niche in an increasingly interdependent world, which is still spellbound by an era of smaller governments and more free enterprise, and by the end of the Soviet Union as an economic power and system. 3 key concepts have to guide us in this national mission. One is that although we recognize the importance of the market forces, the weak economy of Costa Rica needs a small but strategic guiding government to ensure equal opportunities for all of its citizens and to foment income distribution without, of course, transforming itself into the benefactor state. The second concept is that only through continued and better education can we hope to compete in the world environment while at the same time increasing our standard of living. Harsh economic times during the last decade have forced us to reduce our national budget spent on education from 33% to 22%. This tendency must be reversed, and education must be quality upgraded. We must define for ourselves the term illiterate for the next century as those Costa Ricans who are not able to use a computer. And we must start solving that problem today. By the end of this year, Costa Rica will have computer labs in public schools throughout the country, housing 38% of its schooling population. And the third key concept is that economic development has to be sustainable and in harmony with the environment. We have to see the mistakes that the industrialized world has made in order not to copy them as we move towards growth. With courage, with determination, we can achieve these goals. We could achieve them even faster if we could work together tackling regional problems. We see regional problems in 3 areas: in the political area, in the economic area, and as a matter of regional identity. In the political area, foremost is the establishment of peace. With a regional population that is 1/10 that of the United States, during the last 10 years, we lost over 3 times your casualties in Vietnam. Think of that. That is your equivalent of having lost in Vietnam 1,600,000 Americans. Military aid from the United States and the Soviet Union to both governments and counter-revolutionary movements have not proven to be the solution. If the $4 billion spent by the U.S. in aid to El Salvador alone, and much more than that spent by the Soviet Union in aid to Nicaragua, had been spent in social development, that would have been much more effective in terminating the problems of unrest that we still face today. With the Cold War over, there is a new hope for this. And there is the beginning of a period in which Central Americans can ask themselves the question if we continue to need the armies that we have, to fight against whom, or to defend us against what. We should take advantage of the world changes and quit arming the region. Put in your terms, if you want to make a significant, in moral terms, cut to the U.S. budget deficit, cut arms assistance to Central America. Help pave the way. This would help us pave the way for a transition from armed movements to political parties, to take the fight from the battlefield to the ballot box. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua are already on this transition. The Frente Farabundo Martí in El Salvador must continue on this transition. They must copy what other movements in Latin America, like the M19 movement, M19 in Colombia, has already done. And with broader and stronger political parties, we can consolidate the emerging democracies of the region. For the first time in Central American history, we have a democratically elected government in every one of our countries. Costa Rica, who holds elections every 4 years and has held them since 1948, is a clear example that democracy is not consolidated overnight or with 1 or 2 elections under the belt. It takes time. It takes for people to learn of the importance of participation in politics, to vote freely, and to cherish this right. And intermixed with all of these political objectives, of course, is our relation with the United States. To put that in perspective, think of the relation that you would like to have with a hypothetical nation which would be 10 times greater in population than yours, 18 times greater in territory than yours, and 19 times greater in per capita income than yours. I am sure that in spite of the awesome contrast, you would want a relationship of mutual respect, one that would have a clear policy instead of a non-policy, one of permanent attention and not of occasional concern, as a policy towards Central America has been. That's exactly what we want. Economic challenges go hand in hand with political. And here we have 3 main challenges. First of all, our foreign debt is unbearable. Egypt was forgiven $7 billion some weeks ago because of the consequences a regional war had on Egypt. We too have suffered from a regional war during the last 10 years. Poland was granted last week a debt reduction of over 55% of its debt because of the transition it's attempting towards democracy and an open economy. We too are attempting that transition. Treat us no better and no worse than Egypt and Poland. If there is no debt relief, there is no economic growth, and if there is no growth, there is no stability. Secondly, aid to the region has dwindled. In spite of promises to reconstruct Nicaragua and Panama, which are both completely destroyed. In Costa Rica, aid has gone from $265 million to $65 million this year. The local joke back home, of course, is that if we had all taken Nicaraguan citizenship and voted for the Sandinistas, we would still be enjoying $265 million worth of aid. But the bad thing about that is that if the Sandinistas were still in power, Salvador Mayorga would not be here. And we will chalk up the $200 million as part of Salvador's scholarship.
Make a business of it.
Nevertheless, we realize that we cannot depend on aid alone. And that takes us to our third economic difference. Starting from different points and with different speeds, all our countries have embarked on the road of economic structural adjustment, searching for export-led growth. What's discouraging is that in spite of the changes and of the U.S. rhetoric on this matter, industrialized markets are not really open to our products. In Europe, our bananas pay taxes that ACP and ex-colonial countries do not have to pay. In the United States, our meat is boycotted by environmental groups who erroneously believe that by not buying Central American meat, you will avoid rainforests from being transformed into pasture lands. Textiles, shoes, alcohol for combustion are not included in CBI legislation. You would like the Japanese to open up their market. We ask nothing more of you than you ask of the Japanese. President Bush's enterprise for the Americas is favorable and in the right direction, but it will take a long time to implement. And in the meantime, Mexico is already negotiating a free trade agreement, which we hope they achieve. But that free trade agreement will jeopardize foreign investment in Central America and all our exports. The third challenge is our regional identity. How do we bring all of this together coherently? And that requires a change of attitude by us Central Americans. Central America must pull together. True regional spirit should overcome individual, selfish positions. We should strive for common goals in trade, in debt negotiation, in international relations, and in other objectives. We should see ourselves as partners in development and not as competitors in the region. The meeting of the Central American presidents, established as a regular basis as of 1987, is an excellent starting point towards cooperation and unity. We still have much to learn from each other and much to help each other with. Thank you.
Before we begin our questions this evening, I'd like to exercise my prerogative as the moderator and ask a question to the three of you. A theme which runs through all of the presentations is the conflictive role of the United States in the region. And Jose Maria has been fairly explicit about some elements of policy, U.S. policy, that he would like to see in the 1990s. I wonder if our other two panelists could comment in a little more detail about your perception of an appropriate role for the United States in the 1990s in Central America. Some of my colleagues from the region think that benign neglect would be better than the policies of the 1980s. I don't know what I would like to hear from both of you about this. If you don't mind, go ahead, Hector.
Well, certainly I won't try to advise the United States about foreign policy, but I will give my viewpoint from the Guatemalan perspective. And seeing through the years, not far away from here to 50 years ago, you can see clearly that the foreign policy of the United States to Latin America the most, but Mexico, is not to have a foreign policy. And this applies for Central America. So there is no foreign policy that we think there is for Central America or for Guatemala. So there is actually no foreign policy, but just short-term positions for short-term problems or short-term dealings. So when I said that one of the challenges is to have a pragmatic approach to the United States foreign policy, for us Guatemalans is very difficult, because for instance, since 1946, Secretary of State Miller in reference to the problems in the region, said no problems in the region, but a woolly Guatemalan, President Arevalo, with some concepts of social democracy as early in 1947. So it's not a policy for Central America, or exactly for Guatemala. And you will not imagine how much does it weigh to have a foreign policy and confront, or at least not agree with the current way of doing things of United States in Central America. We Guatemalans since 1982 had a active neutrality foreign policy toward Central American problems. And you don't imagine how much we pay in economic terms, in trade, in aid, because of active neutrality to the problems of Central America. Needless to say, do not align yourself with the directives of the United States. To have your own criteria, to have your own opinion, this is very costly for Guatemalans.
Okay. Salvador?
If I had to put it in a very short way, I would say that we would want to see the United States dealing with Central American countries as any other country, nothing very special. I mean, treating us just like equals, like anybody else, and not looking after us as if we were part of a region that the United States has something special to do with. In that sense, I think that the United States should not see as a threat anything that put Central America together. I think one of the problems has been that every time that Central America has tried to get together and deal with its problems as a region, the United States looks at that as somehow as a threat. I don't know if it's the United States security or whatever, but I think the main, a very important thing will be a new attitude in the sense of not disrupting the process of Central Americans getting united and confronting our problems as a whole.
Thank you very much. I think we're open for questions now, and for those of you who are used to attending forum sessions, there are 2 or 3 rules that we try to abide by in the process. First of all, we have 2 microphones down here, and please use the microphones to ask your questions. Second, after my colleagues have taken much more than their 10 minutes each, we are not interested in speeches from the floor, rather questions. So please keep your questions brief, no more than a minute. And also, please address your questions to someone, and also let us know who you are so that our panelists can respond more effectively, thinking a bit about who you are and what you've been doing. Do we have any questions? Okay, we have our first question from here.
Well, I'm interested in biology, conservation, and biodiversity. I know that Costa Rica is already a center for these activities. Ed Wilson of Harvard goes down there very frequently. But I'd like to ask, I think particularly the gentleman from Nicaragua, or anyone that wants to answer, would you like to see greater biological conservation activity? Would you be interested in some type of debt for nature swap? Would you be interested in preserving your resources? Maybe in some way you could market these resources and you could use these resources to get economic aid.
Okay, that's a good question. And who are you, sir?
John Barrett.
Okay. Go ahead, Salvador.
We even have, I mean, in the past years, a few years, Nicaragua has shown concern for its natural resources and for its practices that lead to sustained use of natural resources. And even we have some projects together with Costa Rica in in the borders of our two countries, mainly in the Atlantic coast, one that touches part of Costa Rica, in the northern region of Costa Rica, and also of a southern region of Nicaragua and the Atlantic coast. So the answer would be, as a Nicaraguan, I would say yes, of course.
Jose Maria, perhaps you could comment on the Costa Rican policy, which is an interesting one.
Well, Costa Rica already has 27% of its national territory either in national parks, biological reserves, or some type of a sanctuary. It has already made debt for, it has already converted more than $60 million worth of foreign debt into a trust fund that helps pay for the maintenance of the lands that have been set aside, and in the search for market niches where we feel we are competitive as a country, we are focusing very heavily into ecotourism.
Other questions? Lisa?
My name is Lisa Martin. I'm a student here. I'm wondering, for anybody here, to what extent you think that regional cooperation can happen in a meaningful way, given that some of the Central American countries are very unstable, and there's civil wars of sorts going on, and to what extent you can forge ahead in those conditions.
Any of the panelists? Hector?
I'll try very briefly to answer, Lisa. Of course, regional cooperation is a very good topic for political meetings or political rallies. But being the realities of the country and the difference, the complexities of the countries, we had experiences. The first common market in the continent was the Central American Common Market. And this was a common market based on very basic textile industry and some other transformation industries that really were not Central American money and were not Central American benefiting from it, but perhaps some substitution of leather shoes for plastic shoes or something like that, very, very basic. So I don't see the regional cooperation a factual thing versus the interest of every country. That we've been struggling in Central America for tariffs since the beginning of after Independence Days and for cooperation since Independence Day. But I guess or we are very greedy or we are very pragmatic. But certainly regional cooperation is a very good topic, very good political topic, very well political theme. But I don't see a viable regional cooperation in Central America.
I would not completely agree with Hector's approach on this. I think that the fact that previous experiences have not been very successful in regional cooperation should not lead us to to disregard regional cooperation at this point. Maybe it's a problem of emphasis and not of Hector saying that it's not, and I myself saying that it's yes. But I would even think that although every country has its own problems, even though there's still problems among the different countries in the regions, we should try for any possible form of regional cooperation that would lead us into a deeper understanding and even putting our different local interests aside, a little bit aside, and looking more for regional interests. I think both things should work together.
Jose Maria? No? Okay. Very good. Any other questions? Yes. Please tell us who you are.
I am Paulo Lacerda. I am a Kennedy student. And I would like to invite you to develop a little bit about a civil war that is still alive in Central America. and where I think the United States are still involved, like is the one in El Salvador. And if you have developed the idea that there should be a change on the way of helping these countries that have a problem of development and a problem of social injustice, what would you recommend, like members of the region, for the attitude of the United States in El Salvador, that is something clearly is similar to what has happened in Nicaragua, and something more or less similar to what could have happened in Panama?
Who would like to comment? Go ahead, Hector.
Certainly, it's a very complicated question, but I want Mendel in Salvadorian situation, because I'm not aware or know, I'm not well versed on the Salvadorian situation. But actually, Guatemala had a very unique experience in this. Since I said before, we did away, we forgot the doctrine of national security. So by saying that is that we don't see, or we didn't see ourselves since 1982 as pawns of the Cold War. So it does not apply for us. Certainly in 1981, Secretary Haig drew the line in El Salvador. And you said that the East and West confrontation is already done, but not down there. I mean, there is an impetus. There is something like you have that it will last for at least the next 3 or 4 years, since we already have in place a lot of weapons, a lot of war materials. So is maybe ideologically the confrontation is in other sides of the world is over, but I don't visualize Central America to be out of this inertia for the next 2 or 3 years.
Any of the other panelists like to comment on that? Jose Maria.
I think that in correcting social injustices, we have a great responsibility ourselves in the Central American countries. We cannot depend, or we should not depend on what happens outside, what other countries tell us. And El Salvador has had a long history of social injustices. And while those social injustices are not corrected, you still have the root of a cancer there. And that type of a thing has to be addressed. I think that with the end of the Cold War, there's an opportunity there for a new relationship. I think that, and I believe that we're already seeing that. As of this week, there's a major breakthrough in the negotiations between El Frente Farabundo Martí and the government, where they have both backed down from very intransigent positions that they had been holding in the past at the negotiation table, and which should hopefully clear the way to reaching a ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire in El Salvador.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that El Salvador is a perfect example of what I mentioned before, of the fact that the United States has overlooked the real roots of a problem in El Salvador, has led the United States to his behavior towards El Salvador. And I would also say that I think that in El Salvador and also somehow in Nicaragua, there is still an inertial effect of what used to be, or somehow still, this understanding of a problem in Central America as an East-West confrontation. I think there's still some type of an inertial effect on that, and that still behaving as if there was such a conflict.
Let's go on. Steve?
Yes, I'm Steve Reifenberg, and I work here at the Kennedy School. And a theme that seems to be running through the discussion is the important role of the United States in the region, particularly in the 1980s, the enormous role both because of the Cold War conflict, perceptions of that, and a number of other issues that the United States played in the region. A number, particularly Mr. Mayorga, mentioned that the United States needs to rethink its way that it deals with the Central American region. The question I want to ask is, how do either individually as countries or as a region, are there strategies that Central Americans are thinking in a changing post-Cold War era for dealing with the United States? Are there opportunities now, working individually or collectively, to influence that process, in addition to obviously sending very impressive, articulate individuals like the three of you to talk to groups of people? Are there strategies that you have for trying to change those relationships?
Go ahead.
One of the major points of President Arias before leaving government and in the last meetings with the Central American presidents was that after having gone through many of the items on the political agenda, and those being concluded because now you have democratically elected governments in all of the Central American nations, that development was reaching that point where we had to address that, and we had to address economic issues. And that, of course, flies right in the face of a difficult economic situation in the United States, where aid is being cut not only to Central America but worldwide. We understand that. I believe, Steve, that the remedy there is open markets for our products. That would provide the best incentive to foreign and national investment in each one of our countries, that would stabilize our economies, and that would give us export-led growth. And unfortunately, we don't have a regional strategy towards it. It is several months now since President Bush announced his initiative of a free trade zone for the Americas, and there still has not been very much of a response from the Americas. We're so immersed in our own problems that we seem to be missing those opportunities. And it is time that we put that on our political internal agenda as a priority item that has to be addressed.
Any other responses?
I'd just like to say that to be honest in this, I think we have to recognize that there's no regional initiative on this issue, and that each one of our countries are still tackling with its own problems at this moment. I mean, the problems are really difficult. Every country is going through particularly difficult situations, and there's no regional initiative in any sense. And I would tend to think that it will take some time for an initiative to come up. And I wouldn't look only at governments as source of new initiatives in this. I think we have to be more creative and more flexible in that, and expect initiatives from other sources that might even be different than the government. I'm not saying that initiatives from governments are not important, but I don't think we should expect them as the only source of initiatives in this.
Next question. Go ahead.
Just to support Salvador's idea on this, there is no such a Central American region. I mean, there is Central American region when external forces wants to see us as a region. But then we are just Central American countries. And to have a common strategy is nonsense. We have such diversified characteristics as countries. So some of us are not in a development stage yet. Some of us has to admit that we are in nation-building stage. So it's quite different situations. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Michelle Cavatayo. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. I'm wondering, after spending now almost a year amongst Americans and at the Kennedy School of Government, how this will influence your role, all three of you, as political actors in your individual nations, and especially how this will influence the development of a viable foreign policy with the United States.
Good question, Michelle.
I don't think we have the specific weight to ensure a policy towards Central America. And I think that after the elections in Nicaragua, we are a non-issue. So really, it is up to us in Central America to carve out our own future. And I think that in spite of the differences between our countries that Hector mentions, which are there and which are a fact, we have to work together.
Well, I'm unemployed now. I'm just retired from the military, so I don't think I will have a chance to participate or to provide the basis for enhance the relations between Guatemala and the United States. But certainly this year for me here at the Kennedy School is very profitable, especially by listening to the youth of the United States. How issues as gender, as issues as other issues as ethnic difference and everything is a main concern here in the States. So from Guatemala, I guess I will be able to understand positions in political issues or in social initiatives or economic programs from the United States, because my long relations with this nation and my my attitude of learning and try to understand as much as possible will enlighten me. But how much does it weigh in Guatemala? It's just a question.
Salvador.
Well, I would tend to say about the same thing. Besides the fact that it has been a very, in personal terms, a very pleasant, nice experience and positive in terms of our life as students. Also, I don't think it's going to have a special significance in terms of the relationship with our country with the United States. Although, of course, it's been a very positive experience from a personal point of view.
Okay, another question from this side.
My name is George. I am from Africa. In Africa, we have inequities, institution, we have poverty, institution, we have income disparity, institutions. And I would like to know, to what extent do you think in your country, if you can define poverty in relation to yourself, not in relation to the United States, to the Western country. I would like to know if really we are doing something to deal with poverty in our countries. Thank you.
Well, certainly in Guatemala, poverty is a chronic disease. And we did have some growth in the 70s. But to address the problems of equality distribution of the national wealth is a political issue. So that is why we said that we have, since 1982 in Guatemala, a very, very simple, very clear strategy. With political participation, you will have political legitimacy. With political legitimacy, you can enforce economic changes. With economic changes, someday we will have social justice. But it is participation is the key word for that.
Okay, over here.
Yes, I'm a student of Central America and also a student up here at the law school. And I have a question for Hector Gramacho. That is, it's my understanding that, in fact, one of the serious deterrents to democracy in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador has actually been the military. And given the benefits that they've reaped from the extreme repression and inequalities in the country, what sort of hope can Central Americans have for the future, given also the fact that, at least in Guatemala, the military is so deeply entrenched, both economically and, I still think, politically? Where will the incentive for change come? And I wonder if you also, on a more personal note, might give us some idea of what is the real mentality that exists in the military now and whether there is any hope for serious change.
That's a very good question.
Thank you very much. I really welcome that question, but on purpose, I skip that part of my presentation for the sake of time. But now you're giving me the opportunity. I said that in 1982, the military drastically changed the approach to the Guatemalan problems. For the first thing we did was to drop, forget, did away, renounce the doctrine of national security. And we addressed the problems of Guatemala from a Guatemalan standpoint for Guatemalan solutions. And this was done by the armed forces. The armed forces is the most institutionalized institution in Guatemala. For once, it's unfortunately, but fortunately for us, because since 1982, the political transitions that took place in Guatemala were sponsored and enforced by the military. I'm sorry to say, but the political parties right now in Guatemala are not an institution. They are just in a very beginning stage. And now in Guatemala, the popular organization is stronger than the political parties. So one of the challenges inside the country is that to give the popular organizations power from the popular organizations groups to the political parties to have the political discussion inside the Congress, not in the streets. But this could not happen if the military did not sponsor, since 1982, this political transition. For the first time, we acknowledge, as he said, the political problems and the inequalities in the country. We in the military were so institutionalized that we were able to do the self-assessment of ourselves, or a deep self-criticism of our institution. And the national objectives since 1982 are to achieve reconciliation of the Guatemalan family based on an observance of the human rights, recover individual and national dignity. You don't imagine how affected was national dignity prior to 1982. So it was really, life was very cheap in Guatemala. We are working to enhance national integration, and of course did reorganize the country. The political electoral system was reorganized, and National Assembly outlined another constitution. So since 1982, an effective amnesty program, work, dialogue was asked for to the insurgents. They refused in those days. It was a moral campaign, special tribunals to protect the judges, to implement justice. And the new constitution is a very pluralistic constitution. For the first time since 1986, the Communist Party is authorized to operate freely. Since 1986, we have an ombudsman for human rights. Since 1986, we have a constitutional court. So we did achieve political transition in Guatemala. And of course, the perception that you mentioned on the armed forces is a valid one for, I will say, some 10 years ago of Guatemalan armed forces. So these things are happening in Guatemala because of the changes in attitude and the changes in strategies of the armed forces. So it was a very good question because it gave me the opportunity to explain you, and if you are interested, we can get together later and I brought in on that.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Juan Carlos Martinez, a research fellow with the Kennedy School. Salvador, I believe, that mentioned one objective of sustained growth with equity, being this the basis of political stability. And the other panelists, I believe, that basically did not disagree with its synthesis idea that brings us to the economic front. In a way, the other panelists, and Salvador himself, reflect on a kind of unique historical time where we have a combination of democratic governments in the political front and a strong search for, shall we say, economic efficiency in the economic front. Jose Maria explicitly mentioned structural adjustment programs as one way of, which is also in a way valid in this search for economic growth. It was valid for Nicaragua in the last time of the Sandinista government, and I believe to a certain extent it's also still valid in Guatemala. Now, we know that this type of economic policies worsen the income distribution, at least in the short run. My question is then, have you, any of you, thought of any creative way of dealing with this kind of dilemma at the strategic level of the economic policy? And if so, which will be the basic element that you suggest on this issue?
No. The first time.
Salvador. Go ahead. Jose Maria.
Take the seat.
It is true that structural adjustment has a negative effect on income of certain levels of society. And that is one of our main concerns about structural adjustment in Costa Rica. Some economists will say, well, that's only a short-run problem, and in the long run, everything will work out. But in the short run, people have to eat. And our experience with structural adjustment is that income has been significantly skewed in favor of a new emerging export class and the people who are involved in export areas, and in detriment of people who continue to produce for the local market and are in other sectors. We haven't devised a policy to take care of this problem. We don't have a solution to it. But if you hear of one, let me know, please.
Well, unfortunately, the first time I hear that concept here of structural adjustment. So
I see that you live through that.
In the Kennedy School. Well, my reaction to that would be there's a tendency to talk about structural adjustment programs as the magic solution. I mean, when there's no solution, then you say, well, apply some type of a structural adjustment program. And the concept is used very broadly, and also I think there's some sort of tendency to think of us on the same terms as in fact, as a formula in which you applies a certain number of steps that everyone is supposed to know what those steps are, and they are going to work the same in every country or every society, or almost the same. So, I mean, I don't have a proposal either in terms of what type of adjustment program, but my reaction to that will be that a lot of work has to be done in the sense of bringing the concept of a structural adjustment to the particular conditions of every country, even if the Latin American countries are similar, or even if Central American countries are similar one to each other. When you come to the particular conditions of each country, I mean, you cannot apply the same formula and obtain results.
As the situation is now in Guatemala, we don't dream in try to implement structural adjustments. In 1987, we tried a very mild stabilization program, and we now are worse off because of that stabilization. The reaction of the potential losers of that stabilization program, so we are worse off now. So now the topic in Guatemala is copying the Mexican approach, the social and economic pact. But I'm afraid that in Guatemala the social institutions, let's say unions, are very weak compared with Mexico to have a very stable and fair social and economic pact.
Our last question.
Yes, John Peabody, student of the mid-career program here. Jose, you in particular emphasized the importance of expert-led growth for the economic development of your countries. And as all of you are Caribbean Basin countries, a lot of the attention here tonight has been directed between the relationship between your countries and the United States. But you're also all Pacific Rim countries. And I was wondering if you in particular, Jose, but the other panelists as well, have given any consideration to the attempt to link your markets more closely with the more dynamic markets of the newly industrializing countries of the Pacific Rim, in particular Japan and Korea, South Korea.
Yes, we have addressed that problem, John. Our main trading partner is, of course, the United States. In recent years, we have undergone a major effort to augment our trade with Europe. We feel there is a lot of potential there in the European community, especially after '92 and the unification of the European community. We have also begun exporting to the Pacific, but those are very tough markets to get into. They are also rather sophisticated markets, and we have relatively few products to offer at this point in time who could really contribute to our export base, our total exports in those markets. It's not a short-term objective.
Very briefly, Guatemala certainly is having now a very huge wave of Koreans taking advantage of the free zones for trade and commerce.
Salvador? No. Okay, I believe that we've run out of time, unfortunately. Let's thank our panelists, and you can talk with them more.